I hand straight over to Snow Barlow, who will chair the session prior to lunch.
Thanks, Bruce. My name's Snow Barlow. I'm part of the FTSE organising committee for this symposium. I'm actually vice chair of the FTSE Agricultural Forum, which doesn't feature today, although it's a big user of power, electricity, and intermittency is a big problem for the agri-food industry. This session is really narrowing into Victoria. This is about Victorians' evolving energy mix, and we're split across lunch. The first session before lunch will be about actually looking at the reducing emissions from Victorians' traditional source of energy, brown coal. So it's with great pleasure I introduce first Dr. Paul Feron. Paul is a science leader at CSIRO Energy, and he has been a leading CSIRO post-combustion capture research program since 2007. He's also a lead author in the 2007 fourth assessment report for IPCC. So Paul, wherever is, thank you. It's 15 minutes. I'll give you a thing on 3. Okay. Thanks. Okay.
Well, good morning, or it's good afternoon. So I'll be the first one to serve a much more technological diet just before lunch around a particular technology, and it's around CO2 capture. Before I do that, I'd just like to remind you what CCS is about. It's not strictly speaking an energy technology, it's an emission reduction technology, a CO2 emission reduction technology. And what it does basically, if you have a carbonaceous fuel, you convert that into products or electricity. At some point you generate CO2, you can grab that and transport it and store it underground. You can do that for fossil fuels, but you can also do it for biomass. There is, I apologize that the letters haven't come across as I wanted them to come across. There is a global need for CCS in the sense that if you look at the IEA modeling into the future, and we've just been discouraged from doing any modeling, but we still have to do it, I think, to understand the future. There is an indication that the emission reduction that we need to achieve will be predominantly achieved by renewables and efficiency improvements, and that's to the tune of 75%. But there is a need also to 14% deployment of CCS technology. Now, why is that? It's basically at some point you will need, if you decarbonize your electricity system by renewables, at some point you still will have emissions which are coming from non-power station applications. And also there's a need to have technologies which actually in the second half of the century will actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Thank you very much. And there biomass comes into play, so you can capture CO2 from biomass and store that underground. So there's a need for this technology from that perspective. And the IPCC already in 2014 has also indicated that if you don't have this technology in your portfolio, it will more than double the mitigation costs. So it's a sharp cost increase, and it does that more than any other technology being omitted. Obviously, it comes with challenges. If you go to a power company and tell them that you're going to reduce CO2 emissions and their output will be reduced by 30%, that's not a good news story, obviously. And we also, that's really also linked to the lack of deployment drivers for this technology. The predominant technology to capture CO2 is liquid-based. This is a schematic of that technology, but basically you contact the gas stream with a liquid, it absorbs the CO2, you release the CO2 subsequently by increasing the temperature. And that technology is one that is fairly well developed and is leading the pack in terms of the CO2 capture technologies. It comes with a number of requirements, and this sort of mirrors the trilemma that we're usually trying to satisfy. It needs to be energy efficient, needs to be affordable, and it also needs to be environmentally benign. We're capturing CO2, so it's something you do for the climate, but you don't want to have strange emissions and being added to the atmosphere. So these are the three challenges that we're faced with, and quite a bit of work has been done in the last 15 years in this space in terms of technology development, but also technology demonstration. And this is just a snapshot of a number of pilot plants that have been deployed across the globe. So the next thing is, of course, are there suppliers around for this technology? And sort of 15 years ago, there were only actually 2 suppliers. Since then, we've seen a rush in terms of the technology developments, and we have now a large number of companies, all of them multinationals, which are able to supply you with this technology should it be needed. So these are large-scale companies, and most recently also we've seen a couple of smaller companies, Ion Engineering and Carbon Clean Solutions in the US and in India, respectively, coming to the fore. And these companies have had their technology qualified at the test center in Mongstad in Norway, which is a large-scale testing facility. So the consumer has choice, as you can see, and that is obviously important, judging from the session before this one. We've also seen this technology scaled up to a scale that makes it credible to power companies, so 1 million tons of CO2 per annum. One plant in Canada, which is using Shell CANSOLV technology, and one plant in the USA, which is using MHI technology. And both of these applications have been developed on the back of enhanced oil recovery applications. And this is important to note, that the CO2 is being sold as a product to a client and customer. And that's obviously the best environment to do this. We also have been active in this space for about, well, nearly a decade, at a much smaller scale. And initially, I think the questions that we had to answer is, does it work? Does it work on black coal-fired power stations? Does it work on brown coal-fired power stations? And yes, it does. And since then, we've moved into more a situation where we are preparing for deployment. That means that we have more engaged with technology suppliers to make them understand the special conditions in Australia in particular, and also make sure that this technology is deployable at a cost that is affordable to Australia. And obviously, as a research organization, we also emphasize new technologies and develop pilot plant demonstrations for those. The arrows here are somewhat flexible, and they move. If you notice some of our previous presentations, they tend to go backwards because technology is not being deployed yet. When we're talking about deployment in Australia and Victoria in particular, it comes with a number of challenges. One of them is that Australian power plants in general don't have emission controls except particulate control. Here in Victoria, we have a low heating value of fuel because of the high water content, which we need to grapple with. That makes you start off with a low efficiency in the first place. And we also have, of course, particulate removal in place, which makes things easy in terms of deploying CCS or PCC in particular. This emission level of, say, 1.1 ton per megawatt hour is quite high. The global average is around 0.5 ton per megawatt hour, and the numbers that the IEA uses in around 2060 is around 50 grams per megawatt hour. So you can see we need quite a drastic change in the emission levels of existing power stations if we're going to be successful with this. And that's quite a challenge over the next couple of decades. A little bit of a survey of overview of what we've done. So we've trialed a number of these amine solutions, these liquid absorbents. and showed that basically it worked in terms of capture efficiency, energy requirement. We were able to validate process modeling. That's important when we make the next steps. And we were able to show some early benefits from new amine formulations. The other thing we did was also to look at emissions. So when we started to develop this technology in the early days, there was a concern around emissions of amines, emissions of byproducts. And with funding from Analog R&D and the Global CCS Institute, we were able to investigate that and to ensure for one particular technology that this wouldn't be a concern to the local environment. And that's an important output of the pilot plant program. As I mentioned, most recently we moved into a more intensive collaboration with technology suppliers. So in 2015 we started up a project together with IHI, Japanese technology supplier in Australia, best known for the supply of boilers, but also for the oxyfuel project, the Callard oxyfuel project in Queensland, where they were the technology supplier. The focus of this project is obviously around reducing the energy requirement of the capture process, but it's also around showing the long-term performance of this technology. So we operate a pilot plant then for 5,000 hours to really look at degradation and see the impacts that that has on the process performance. This shows you a slide of the pilot plant as it's been installed, just in front of the one that was there. And the IHI technology is based on novel packing materials, process designs, and the new amines. When it comes to the techno-economics, we set up a system to do that from first principles. It's the engineering approach, as Paul referred to initially. And we've developed some cost data, and this is based on the standard technology. And as you can see that this gives you a bit of an idea of the investment for 1 unit of a brown coal-fired power station, and it also gives you an idea of where the cost component is. That this is important for our research to be able to define where we should make our research investments. Overall, when we did those sums, we ended up with $75 per megawatt hour added on to the wholesale price for this standard technology. But obviously this is an nth of a kind technology, an application. The first of a kind of application would most likely be a lot more expensive than this one. But it really guided our research program in a very instructive manner. It also showed us where these capital cost pain points were, and they are in particular on anything which is exposed to the flue gas, because that's going to be large and very capital expensive, and that's where we put in some of our research funding in that space. Now, there is quite a bit of potential to reduce these costs, so bring down that number of $75 per megawatt hour to much more acceptable levels. And there's basically two approaches here. One is an engineering approach, and this is basically the learning by doing approach, but if we don't do, we don't learn. So it's really important that we also get some larger scale experience. We looked at modularization, we looked at non-conventional suppliers, but also there's a degree of flexibility in introducing CCS onto a coal-fired power station, because you can switch the capture plant off according to the needs of the market, and that's a big advantage of this technology. Obviously, as a research organization, we also focused on technology and development, so we looked at innovative process designs, novel equipment, and new amine formulation. And this is the sort of the pillars that we're trying to follow in terms of making this technology a lot cheaper than it is right now. The first thing that comes to mind, of course, is the energy requirement for the capture process. This is where the technology was around 10 years ago. Since then, we've seen a 25% reduction in terms of the energy requirement for the capture process, which is impressive, I would say. But we think there's actually another 25% is possible using advanced concepts. And that's really the improvement potential. But we're also looking at beyond that, where we're trying to integrate renewable energy systems into a PCC installation, where you would be able to get to zero additional energy requirement for the capture process. And this sort of marries off renewable energy and fossil fuel. It's a challenge to do that, I can tell you, but it has some benefits to do that. In terms of other ways to reduce cost, we've been engaging in the past quite productively with Chinese suppliers, did costing together with the Chinese suppliers, and here you see some numbers in terms of the cost per CO2, ton CO2 avoided for Australia and for China. You have to do the conversion yourself, but typically the cost difference is a factor 2 to 3 when you look at technologies in China and in Australia. Now, a technology in China might not be acceptable in Australia, might not be transferable to Australia, but there's surely a potential to bring in some cost reductions, significant cost reductions, if you look at more critically about this on the suppliers of this technology. On the technology side, we've been focusing on making the system a lot simpler. At the moment, if you have to introduce PCC, post-combustion capture, on an existing power station, you need to install flue gas desulfurization first, and we're trying to simplify that, and we hope to be able to achieve this a drastic reduction in capital costs, around 20%. It's a very important technology development for us. We also look at different systems to remove SO2, where we've used activated carbon to remove SO2, which is a system that works. And more interesting, we're able to make these activated carbons from brown coals that are actually mined here in the Latrobe Valley. So there's an interesting combination of technologies there. Finally, we also looked at amine developments, because that's the core technology, where we focused on amines which are particularly resistant to nitrous oxides, which are present in flue gases in Australia. And I've come up with a number of amines which are resistant to that, and we're following those lines of research as well. And we also looked at trying to make a combination with the long investigated application of brown coal drying before you actually burn the coal. And there we see a potential to use selective flue gas recycling, which uses the CO2 from your flue gas to dilute the incoming combustion air, and that really enables you to have a fully dried brown coal combusting in an existing boiler. That's an interesting development that we're pursuing as well. In summary, so CCS is really essential, and that's a globally accepted view for meeting climate change mitigation goals. We think that the retrofit options are the ones that will give you immediate CO2 emission reductions, and you can do that via phased introduction. It is technology feasible to apply PCC on existing power stations in Australia, but also obviously Victoria. There are a sufficiently large number of suppliers for technology delivery, and we do need really detailed engineering studies to make this happen. I would call what we've done is more or less dry knowledge in terms of the techno-economics. It needs to be validated by proper, focused feed studies. And there is an untapped potential for capital cost reductions. And my last slide is this one. We'll be hosting in Melbourne the next Greenhouse Gas Technology Conference in about a year from now. And I'd all invite you to join that. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. We're going to have a joint question and answer session after Jane Burton. It's a great pleasure now to introduce Jane Burton. Jane is Acting Executive Director of Low Emission Resources at the Department of Economic Development, Jobs, Transport and Resources, DECITA. And she is responsible for the developing of an integrated, comprehensive, long-term plan for the sustainable development of Victoria's coal resources and associated infrastructure. Jane Burton. Yes. I'll give you a signal 3 minutes to go.
Right, thank you. This way. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. Yes, it is. Yep, it is. I'm swear. Oh, yep. We have Technology, how do I make that? Where is the clicker?
The clicker is here.
Oh, right there.
And I reckon if you want that, it should go.
There we
So
go.
Right-hand side goes forward, left-hand back.
Fantastic, thank you kindly. So I just want to firstly caveat the presentation. I think I'm under the heading of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from existing brown coal power stations. That's not my job, and it's not the government's job. So I guess what I'm here to talk to you about today is our newly released coal policy. So to give everyone information on what is contained within that policy, and also to give you an update on the Carbonate Project. Now, if both of those things put together can assist in reducing greenhouse gas emissions from existing or new brown coal power stations, that's up to the market to see if that can happen. But my job is really just to tell you what the Victorian Government's policy is. So just as a reminder for those that have forgotten or aren't aware, that Victoria's brown coal is huge on a world scale. We have a very large resource, and most of it is located in Gippsland in the Latrobe Valley, where obviously the two operating brown coal mines are, powering the state. I think it's around 80-something% at the moment. So the numbers, around 430 billion tonnes of in situ brown coal. Of that, we have 65 billion tonnes is of the measured coal, and 33 billion tonnes is potentially economic. The number that's not on there is that there is around 13 billion tonnes that's currently unallocated of that brown coal. And I guess to put all of those huge numbers into context for you, for about the last 100 years of powering, upwards of 95% of the state's electricity, we've used around 2 billion tonnes of coal. So that tells you that we have a very large brown coal resource in the Latrobe Valley. Typical characteristics, and it does vary because we do have a number of seams in that coal, but I'm not going to read through them all other than to say it has high moisture, and outside of the high moisture it is a very clean coal, which I think's been said before, with low ash and low sulphur particularly. It has very good, the other point probably of note is the stripping ratio. It has very thick seams of coal, so the cost of mining on a world scale is quite low. That's enough about the coal resource. On July the 7th this year, the Victorian Government did release a statement on the future uses for brown coal. The statement did take into account findings from an independent review, which was led by Rhys Edwards, looking at previous government programs for coal development. That report had, I think, 14 recommendations, of which the government accepted all 14 of those recommendations. There is a copy of the executive summary of that report on our website, if anyone's interested to have a look around the detail of what's contained in those recommendations. It has 4 key elements, which I will just cover off a little bit in more detail further into the slide, but those key elements: it does set an emission standard, it does talk about access to coal. For access to coal, the coal in the Latrobe Valley area is under what we call a moratorium, or a Section 7 under the Minerals Act. It's actually, you can't just go and apply for coal within that area under the Minerals Act. The government controls the coal and allocates the coal within that area. Outside of that area, the normal provisions of the Minerals Act apply. So the statement does talk about accessing coal. It talks about the establishment of an independent expert panel. Sitting alongside that independent expert panel is some decision-making guidelines. Both of those things are under development at the moment. And I guess importantly, the government recognises that there is investment in jobs that can be delivered from the brown coal, so we have this open for business approach. There won't be programs like the previous Advanced Lignite Demonstration Program that we've had in the past. It will be open for business, and each project will be considered through that independent expert panel and considered on its merits. So the emission standard, it is 0.45 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour as applied to coal for electricity generation, or 0.3 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per tonne of coal if you're using the coal for other things. The emission standard was set as an equivalent number to existing efficient gas-fired generation, and at the moment it's an interim standard for any project that wants to establish itself and set up in Victoria really from 7th July onwards. That interim emissions standard will apply and it will be regulated through the works approval process through the EPA. It will be going through a regulatory impact statement through DELPA doing that work, and that number will be confirmed through that process, and then it will be legislated in the Environment Protection Act. It applies to projects using more than 27,000 tonnes of coal. It covers direct emissions only, and if a project can't meet those emission standards, they have two pathways to meet the standard. One is through carbon capture and storage or some form of CCUS or eligible offsets. So they're the two pathways. So we're not saying that you have to meet that in your own right. You do have two other pathways to meet the standard. Access to coal. Preference is given to projects accessing coal from existing mines. So in the first instance, we encourage project proponents to go and talk to now the two existing miners to see if they can reach some sort of a commercial coal supply agreement. If they're unable to do that and can provide sufficient evidence to the government they've been unable to reach commercial terms, then the government have said that they would consider a future coal allocation that would likely to be adjacent to the existing coal fields. And as I've just said it before, the estate is adopting an open for business approach. Projects will be considered on a case-by-case basis, and there will be an independent expert panel that will be established that will consider each project based on its economic, social and environmental merits prior to it being considered against all other opportunities for the state through the investment pipeline. The panel, will be staged and supported by, like I've said, this panel is yet to be established. We're looking probably about a 4-person panel, a chair, and then a commercial expert, a technical expert, and environmental expert. And we're hoping to have that set up around the end of the year. Now I'll just talk a bit about the Carbonate Project. So the Carbonate Project is investigating the potential for a commercial scale CCS network in Gippsland. It involves capturing CO2 from industrial sources in the Latrobe Valley and then transporting it via a pipeline to the coast and injecting it offshore in the Gippsland Basin, more than 1 kilometre below the sea level. The project is jointly funded by Commonwealth and Victorian governments, so it's supported by both tiers of government. And there's a significant amount of research, world-leading scientific research being done by Carbonate's research partners. The CO2 CRC is Carbonate's lead research organisation, supported by the University of Melbourne, CSIRO and a number of other universities. Carbonate's currently working collaboratively with industry to secure customers and investors in a CCS service. And one example of that we've been working very closely with over the past few years is the Hydrogen Energy Supply Chain Project, which is, some people would call it the KHI project, but it does have a broader consortium involved. And that project is looking at making hydrogen from Victoria's brown coal, liquefying it and transporting it to Japan. So where's the Carbonate Project at right now? It's been a bit of a long journey and it's had a stage-gated approach to its progress. So you'll see the red line says "We are here," which is at project development. And in February this year, both Commonwealth and Victorian governments agreed to progress Carbonate to the stage 3 to project development based on a very comprehensive business case. There's been a lot of work completed in concept and feasibility stages so far. And really, I think we've adopted this stage-gated approach to provides government the opportunity to make prudent investment decisions as the risk and uncertainty is reduced. And the ultimate plan for the Carbonate Project at the moment, it sits as a project within the state government. The ultimate plan is to transition it to the private sector. So there's for the construction and commissioning phases. So there's been quite a bit of work at looking at various models for that transition to occur. Carbonate is really agnostic as to where the CO2 comes from. They'll take it from anybody who wants to pay to put it in the pipeline. But some of the work that's been done so far, they've done comprehensive risk-adjusted cost calculations to work out where perhaps the most likely sources might be. And just showing on that graph there, it's showing natural gas processing, fertiliser or hydrogen production are at the moment are showing the most cost-effective options. The work that's been done by the Carbonate Project shows that CCS could be viable in these industries with a carbon price of around $30 a tonne. It's also an option in other industries such as retrofitting a brown coal-fired power station, but the costs we think would be much higher. Just to give you an update on the outcomes of stage 2. So Carbonate during stage 2 has undertaken a lot of geological and regulatory work. The project went through a rigorous process to select 3 potential storage sites, and they now have a prioritised site in the offshore Gippsland Basin. They have 5 greenhouse gas assessment permits, which gives the project legal access to explore the sites. And a lot of work's also being done on the future CCS network in Gippsland, looking at potential pathways for pipelines and easements. So there has been a lot of work done prior to stage 3. This is the prioritised storage site, Pelican. It's offshore in the Gippsland Basin east of Sale. They have done extensive modelling on that site, including independent verification and certification. And the site has capacity, very conservative estimate, P90 confidence of 125 million tonnes of CO2 storage. The next step for the Carbonate Project is to submit the declaration of storage for regulators for approval. So right here, right now, the team is really busy on stage 3. We have right as we speak, they're assessing tenders for marine seismic survey to happen in the next summer in the weather window, probably around February, March. The offshore appraisal well is looking at the following summer because a lot of these activities have to be done in the appropriate weather windows. So that's underway as well. Stakeholder community engagement is an extremely important part of this project, and there's been a very focused effort in meeting with certainly local communities down in that Wellington, Sale, Golden Beach area, along with fisher people and others who have an interest in this work. CO2 CRC is also conducting further scientific research with the CSIRO, University of Melbourne, University of Wollongong and Anlec R&D. So really the next steps are to get the declaration of storage approved, then an injection licence, and then working with industries to find some customers. So that's really all I had to talk to you about today, was to give you an update on those 2 areas that government is currently working on. So be pleased to take, well, any questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Jane. Paul, can you come and join us? And this will be a joint present. We'll just do it from the front here without taking a seat there. Come on, Paul. Any questions? Oh, David.
Really, comment, Snow. I'll just make the point that with the numbers that Paul was talking about, the number and the potential for capturing for sequestration in Victoria, the numbers are coming out somewhere in the same ballpark as renewables with energy storage. So, you know, $100 a megawatt hour or thereabouts. And the other point I'd make is that the reason for bringing all this together is that if CCS is in fact going to occur anywhere in Australia, the best opportunity is obviously in Victoria, where we've got a huge depleted oil and gas reservoir offshore. What Jane was talking about now is just a very small part of what they're trying to delineate now. So it seems to me that it's, you know, not dissimilar to what should be possible with renewables in the longer term, particularly if some of the cost reductions that Paul was talking about do come about. So that's just to try and pull the whole thing together.
Yes, thank you. Do you want to comment, Paul?
No, but, well, yes. I'd like to stress that in terms of the modelling, it's really retrofit which is should be the focus. The modelling that Paul has done is around life cycle cost, and that's a different cost because it incorporates the power station as well. And I think if you deploy this technology, it's really done on a retrofit basis because you only pay for the capture plant. Obviously, we have nothing in place in terms of regulation which would pay for such a plant, and that's still lacking.
Thank you. There's another question across here.
Yeah, Barry Hooper here. Just following on from that, certainly the costs of that retrofit fall within the bands that Tony Wood mentioned. We all have to be careful about the numbers. But relating then to the coal statement and the emissions requirement, if you put in a partial capture facility, the cost is not X, it's 20% less, it's 80% of the X. So if you say it's $100, when you're doing the partial capture to meet the coal statement, significantly reducing the emissions, it will be cheaper, say $80. Okay, and that's possible because in our case, very inefficient plants, heat recovery can drive a lot of this process, very low cost fuel, and you end up hitting cost trilemma in terms of cost, in terms of emissions, and you get a more flexible plant because you can recover that power that you're not using and capturing CO2 when you need it and stop capturing for a short period. So it's very useful to stay to reliability of the grid.
Take that as a comment. Tony?
I guess in the last few months there's been quite a lot of discussion around new coal-fired power stations in Australia. And in all the discussion around keeping coal plants running and all that sort of stuff, and new plants, and high intensity, low emission plants, HELI plants. I don't think the CCS issue has got onto that agenda at all, like zero. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to just, reflect my own involvement, Jane, with Carbonate. I mean, it started, I think, in 2008-9, something like that, right? As far as I know, no molecules have actually been injected yet. So there's the challenges, right? How do you see the sort of numbers that the potential you've been talking about for coal, or the potential for CCS squaring with the reality? The reality is that people who actually have to make decisions clearly don't think it's credible. Yeah. I mean, I may have wasted some years of my life, but I certainly found it interesting. But that's what I'm still puzzled. What has to change? Or is this never going to, this is always going to be the unborn child in a sense?
Both of you, I guess. Do you want to comment first, Paul, and then Jane?
I can start and give a couple of perspectives. Where the technology is working and is being deployed is where you have a value on your CO2, and I've presented an example of that. It's also happening where there is some sort of regulation in place, and Norway is the best case, where you have a CO2 tax offshore, which has driven at least 2 projects in this space. And that experience, which goes back to 20 years ago, has actually led to the Norway government now to say, well, anybody who's willing to develop a CCS chain should not be worried about the storage of CO2, nor be worried about the transport of CO2. We've got that covered. And that's basically on the experience of the existing plants like Sleipner and Snøhvit. So Norway is now not moving ahead with CO2 capture from power stations, because basically you don't have a lot of those in Norway. But they're focusing on cement, they're focusing on waste combustion, they're focusing on ammonia production, where they see as that perhaps being the first step. This might not be the case, obviously, in Victoria, but that's a model that works over there. But it's a pain point, and it's still hurting after 15 years, I think. It hasn't been resolved that there's nothing there that will pay for an emission reduction, where there is something there that pays for extra power onto the grid, whether you need it or not.
Jane?
I guess we have to acknowledge that the Carbonate baby has had a long gestation. There's no question about that. But I think now that we have a policy statement, we have an emission standard, that we have, I can say without giving away any confidences, that we have a number of projects who are telling us that the numbers stack up, the business case is there, and that they're very interested in accessing that Carbonate project. So, and it's a matter of having, a project and Carbonate sort of occurring in parallel. So the timing is right.
Forgive me if I don't understand this. Is there a market, are we talking about here, are we talking about a market for the captured CO2 in further extraction of oil or something like that? Or are we talking about a market for sequestration?
Talking about for sequestration. So we're talking about projects, for example, the coal to hydrogen project. So it will need to sequester its CO2 to meet the emission standard, and it's very seriously, it needs the Carbonate project to be successful. Yeah, absolutely.
It's a matter of
Sorry.
it's a matter of quantity as well. So the scale of this technology is so large that the options for CO2 utilization are there, but they won't make a lot of difference in terms of the CO2 emission, the overall CO2 emissions.
Yeah.
But I can certainly see a lot of companies interested because they have an emission of a couple of million tons per year. And if they can address that with a CO2 utilization option, they've got their problem covered, basically. So,
Bruce.
Thanks, Snow. Jane, I'm curious about the sort of social license to operate. What's been, what's the reactions that you're getting? Because, I've always felt that unless you can overcome that, CCS is going to suffer the same fate as fracking, and maybe even worse. So I'm just curious, what has Carbonate learnt along the way, and what's been the reaction when you've gone out and actually talked to people who've either got to have a CO2 pipeline going across their land, or indeed have to go and fish underneath where that funny CO2 stuff is stored?
Yeah, really good question, Bruce. And no question, it is a challenge. And I guess we thought 3 years ago there was huge potential for just, the whole CSG and CCS to be confused, because they're both three-letter acronyms. They're both kind of about a gas. That wasn't the case. We did 17 open days across the whole state of Victoria on onshore gas and coal seam gas, and there was not one question that confused the two, or not one event was CCS even raised. The work that's been done so far, certainly in the Gippsland, has been a lot of social research, and we've used Peter Ashworth and her team have done a lot of focus groups and work. Most people seem to be very accepting of CCS as a pathway to low emissions future, and from there is certainly going to be some issues with right here, right now, with some of the work that's been proposed for out in the around the Pelican site with some of the potential fishermen and some of those people. So we're having ongoing dialogue with those groups at the moment. So it's certainly not an easy run home, but we're committed to having those conversations using science and evidence to show impacts, and to really understand those and to mitigate those. So I think it's critical that we continue to put information out into the public domain. We have those presentations, we have open days, all of those things. Definitely an important part.
Thank you. Look, can you join with me in thanking Paul and Jane for this session? We will be coming back with a panel session on this same general topic after lunch. But thank you, Jane, and thank you, Paul.